As goes Egypt, so goes the Middle East? It is impossible to understand the Arab Spring without Egypt, the Arab world's largest country and a strategic player in the region. Images of protesters in Tahrir Square, Cairo, in January and February 2011, which helped trigger the end of 30 years of dictatorship under Hosni Mubarak, have come to epitomize the revolutions that many now call the Arab Spring. If you haven't had a chance to listen to the first episode in our mini-series on events in the Arab world, 10 years on, we recommend going back to listen to our episode on Tunisia.
The resignation of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak after 18 days of protest filled Cairo's Tahrir, or Liberation Square, with celebrations. But with that freedom comes unanswered questions about Egypt's political future.
I'm Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy.
And I'm Alistair Somerville, editor at the Institute and producer of this podcast mini-series, Diplomacy and the Arab Spring at 10.
To explore the origins, events, and legacies of revolution and subsequent counter-revolution in Egypt, we brought together Ambassador Ann Patterson.
My name is Ann Patterson, and I was ambassador to Egypt from middle of 2011 till the mid-2013. And when the Arab Spring broke out, which was essentially in January and February of 2011, I was studying Arabic to get my Arabic back up to snuff before I went to Egypt. I had just finished a few months before an assignment as ambassador to Pakistan.
And Mohammed Soliman.
It's Mohammed Soliman, and 10 years ago I was protesting. I was in Tahrir Square in the day when the revolution started. Right now I am residing in Washington. I work for a consulting firm, McFarland Associates. I'm also a scholar with the Middle East Institute.
During this episode, you'll also hear again from Tamara, Wittes, who will help us make sense of how events in Egypt tied together with developments across the region.
As we gather perspectives on Egypt's story before, during, and since 2011, we'll also hear from another scholar practitioner, Rita Stephan.
My name is Rita Stephan, and I am a research affiliate with the Moise Khairallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies at North Carolina State University. And currently I'm the regional coordinator for religious and ethnic minorities at USAID.
Rita is also the co-editor with Munira Sharad of a new book, Women Rising, In and Beyond the Arab Spring, which brings together a diverse set of female voices from across the region. During this mini-series, Rita guides us through perspectives from her book and her broader work on gender, politics, and activism in the Middle East and North Africa.
So there was a Facebook invite. There was a call for protest in Egypt right after the success of the Tunisian revolution to oust Ben Ali. I was at that time a college student. I was doing my finals at that time, and I lied to my family, and I went to Tahrir Square on the 25th of Jan. It was interesting time. It was thousands of people in Tahrir Square. That's something I didn't see, I didn't witness before. The country didn't witness before, especially during the Mubarak years. The moment I realized that this is different, I think I'm obsessed with history, and I know my society very well to understand that this is different in scale, different in masses, different in demographics, and this is important. Before Tahrir Revolution, it was most of the protests were confined to old 1970s leftist, white hair, and these are the usual Mubarak protesters. But when you go in the streets and you find teenagers, young people, women, different social classes, that's something different. And also the numbers. Before the Tahrir Revolution, it was usually 500s, hundreds. Maybe during the Iraq War protest, you had thousands, few thousands. But that was different. We speak about marches that and Ambassador Patterson know how mighty Tahrir Square is. If you can fill Tahrir Square, that means you have a big number.
Here's Ambassador Patterson.
And watching, it was actually fairly interesting to watch it sort of in Arabic. But I think most people realize that that the demonstrations in Tunisia had sort of taken on a life of their own, and they were beginning to start elsewhere, and it was sort of a cascade effect, I think. But I think Mohammed's right. It was the age of the protesters. It was, frankly, the economic class of the protesters, which was pretty obvious, and then the obvious reluctance of the government to crack down, which was one of the more interesting elements of it. And so they were very reluctant, I think, probably no doubt what they'd seen in Tunisia, to crack down on demonstrators. Compared to what's taken place more recently, there wasn't the sort of massive roundups.
What did this all look like from Washington? As we go through the series, we'll try to piece together how decision makers in the US government viewed events across the region as the uprisings unfolded. Here's Tamara Cofman Wittes.
And so there was already some discussion going on about the rising pressures for reform, the rising expressions of dissent, including in places like Egypt, where we saw an upswing in wildcat labor strikes and small street demonstrations and stuff in the couple of years leading up to the Egyptian revolution. So, the first thing is to say this didn't come out of thin air from the perspective of policymakers. No one was predicting revolutions, but we certainly understood that there was a lot of dissent and a lot of pent-up pressure for change. We knew that Police Day was coming up in Egypt, January 25th. It was an annual holiday. It was often a day on which Mubarak released prisoners, and it was often a day on which there were demonstrations against police repression. But this year was going to be different, both because of Tunisia and because of what had been going on in Egypt the year before. The murder of Khalid Said, this young man in the city of Alexandria who was pulled out of an internet cafe and beaten to death on the street by Egyptian security, who then tried to plant drugs on his body. His murder had galvanized protests across the country. And we knew that activists were planning for Police Day to be another big mobilizing event. We also knew that activists had been trying to figure out ways to circumvent the state's efforts to break up protests. We just didn't know if they were going to be successful. Well, they were successful beyond their wildest dreams.
And I would talk to people who had been in Tahrir Square who were, say, 27, 28 years old and had come out of the universities and really couldn't find employment. And some people had been unemployed for years. And what we'd seen in Egypt was a dramatic expansion of university education, but a lot of it wasn't, frankly, very good. So that was one factor. The other factor, too, which I don't think was so obvious unless you were there was a really considerable degree of police corruption and brutality. And Egypt has a huge Ministry of Interior, about millions of people, and it was largely an undisciplined force. I think that was a big driver, and then sort of generalized corruption. I think what Egyptians had seen, particularly younger ones who couldn't get a job, certainly there have been a lot of economic reforms, but they saw a lot of people get very rich very quickly and live very ostentatiously, and that upset people, particularly when they didn't see that their own prospects were very promising.
Yeah, indeed. I definitely agree. Corruption is an underlying root cause. Economic grievances in general, and that was cross classes. Poor people, middle class, people feeling that they're left behind. And again, maybe that grievance stems from a Nasser nostalgia to Nasser era state being the main driver for economy. However, people feel they're left behind. Younger generations are unemployed. That was definitely a factor.
Here's Rita Stephan.
Many would say that the Arab Spring was not an economic revolution, but Arab Spring 2.0 is or was. And so Arab Spring 1.0 is about freedoms and democracy, right? But then, and then we quickly thought, okay, we had the revolutions, let's have elections. And this is where we have to take a step back and look into democratic transitions. And what do you have? You cannot have democracy without having economic standards that really make it possible for democracy to prosper. Many of these countries have issues with economic management, whether they came from a socialist regime like Syria and Libya and Yemen, or they're kingdoms that they're trying to manage their economies. In particular, and women activists and feminists have for long understood the two as going together. And women's rights and really class issues, economic rights. And think about it from their perspective, it's because their participation in the economy all throughout the region has always been, probably is the lowest in the world, because of this heavy duty that's put on them by the patriarchal system for caregiving for their families. However, when women are in the workplace, they face same issues that men face in terms of exploitation, labor rights, but they face additional issues and additional problems, and those including safe transportation, equal pay, and sexual harassment in the workplace. Really, the Egyptian revolution started with the labor movement, of which women were main organizers. And you really cannot achieve democracy without achieving economic equality or economic equities. And we see this definitely an issue that we alluded to in the book in Egypt. This is an issue in Jordan. This is an issue in Morocco, as well as today we are seeing this as an issue in Tunisia. The democracy is not sustainable in Tunisia without an economic solution.
Here's Mohammed.
I will also add that the question of succession was important for Egyptians. I think it was very, very insulting for Egyptians in general. The fact that Mubarak will pass his own office to his son. That idea was insulting, especially for a nation that's taking pride in being a republic, a pioneering republic in that part of the world. So having the president acting as a king and passing the throne to his own son, that was insulting. People didn't like it. People didn't really appreciate it. People felt they're losing that kind of idea of a republic that Nasser one time built. So that was also a big component of it, because that was the intellectual framework surrounding the Egyptian opposition that laid the groundwork for the revolution eventually. People who are against the succession, the Kfaya movement, Enough movement, and then when Mohammed Bradey, a Nobel Prize winner, went back to Cairo, his entire movement was all about elections. It's all about banning or basically standing against that kind of succession.
So that's a really important point, because it has another element to it. Who also wasn't very happy with that was the Egyptian military. So because they didn't like Gamal Mubarak, they didn't trust him. A lot of his friends were these people I'd mentioned who gotten very rich very quickly. And so when the demonstrators demanded that Mubarak step down, there were many in the military who didn't think that was such a bad idea.
Yeah, indeed, I can definitely agree with that, and they made it very clear. The military, by its own nature, they want some sort of transition that exists within the existing framework, and Gamal Mubarak represented for them crony capitalism, pure corruption, and people who are not going to preserve the Egyptian national security broadly defined. I think the demographic speaks for itself. It's people who look like me, like in Cairo at least. People look like me, middle-class kids, some English-speaking capabilities, somehow good education, updated about what's happening in the world. I understand that there's some sort of a movement that started with Obama election 2008, and that was a really, really has a big effect in Egypt. A lot of the techniques that were used by the Obama Hope slogan and his campaign techniques on Facebook were actually utilized in the Egyptian revolution. So that demographic was very active, forward-looking, progressive, wants democracy in the country, also want to be part of the global, at that time, globalization was an attractive idea for people. But also in addition to that kind of middle-class kids, you had also lower-class people, like we're speaking about people who are struggling economically, like the ambassador said, people who are left behind, factory workers, people who are have informal housing, people who have grievances because of the Egyptian police brutality at that time under Habib al-Adli. So we have a coalition of people. At the beginning of it, the middle-class kids were taking the lead, taking the charge.
Social media and activism online certainly played a role during the 2011 revolutions. But there was more to it than that. Rita Stephan explains.
At the time, I had published probably the first article on women's cyber activism, published it in 2006, and women's leadership and the spread or prevalence of connectivity. And I remember when Tunisia happened, everybody called it the Twitter revolution. And this was kind of an issue that we were all thinking, no, it's not the Twitter revolution. Yes, it's just a means that activists use, but things have been really boiling for years and we haven't been paying attention. You really have to look at this issue historically. I've been following cyber activism since 1990. And what we see is the traditional fora are not open to women, to minorities, or to the youth. And so this is where men meet and deliberate about, politics and the well-being of the countries as the caretakers of the country. But where are the women? So that's one area where we see in the book, for instance, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, they talk about that space.
In Washington, the US administration had a problem. The Mubarak regime had been a long-standing security partner, and Egypt was a strategic player in the region. So when Ambassador Patterson arrived in Cairo as US ambassador in the summer of 2011, what goals did she bring with her?
So I was in Arabic, and then I left Arabic to go sort of work on these policy issues, frankly, much to my dismay, because you really needed the language in Egypt. But everyone, I think, realized that this was a really big deal in the Arab world. And the American administration was really quite torn with how to respond to this. And Mubarak had been around forever. He was a known quantity. People like Bill and Hillary Clinton had probably visited him dozens of times, and they wanted to. And then it was seen that the stability of Egypt was extremely important, not least of which because it was next door to Israel. So that played into this debate too. But there was much conflict, not conflict, but much discussion, and of course, then the President Obama supported that Mubarak would step down. And when I got there, really our goals were super simple, and we debated a lot whether this was the right goal. It was basically to encourage a democratic transition in Egypt and to move the military to elections as soon as possible. This had some complicating subsidiary issues like the NGOs, NDI and IRI. And again, that was controversial within the US government that they should operate there in Egypt. That was very much resisted by the military and eventually by the Egyptian people. But that was our goal in Egypt, was to promote a democratic transition.
I'm very cynical, and I believe I'm very realist at that time. And my gut feeling was that movement will not succeed for a lot of reasons. Including there is no political structure, and no institutions, there are no real political parties. So it was Pandora's box. And At that time, I was very cynical, realist, and my understanding that we didn't have institutions, parties, and any sort of organized groups that can take the baton and move with it. So we ended up with the real power brokers in Egypt dictating the terms of the transition. So that was happening at that time, and we went through parliamentary elections, and that meant certain kind of majority get to dictate how you write the constitution. And once you write the constitution, you ultimately dictate what's the path forward for the country. And with the people in the streets absent from that kind of political discussion, and that political discussion was mainly between the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, SCAF, and they were in charge of the government at that time, and the Muslim Brotherhood as the biggest political group in the country. And people in the streets were not involved. That meant that the discussion that was supposed to take place in Parliament about drafting the constitution and the path forward took place in the streets, meaning political violence was really in the rise at that time, between 2011 to 14 and 15 even. Political violence, social factions, unrest in unprecedented way. And eventually that meant that we lost the sympathy of the people. Eventually, if you don't deliver for the people, they will not support your cause. If your cause will not really feed their kids, their own grievances, their own socioeconomic grievances, there is no meaning of the entire revolution. And this is what we have seen in 2013 eventually, when the people supported the military intervention, because when you talk to my uncles, people who actually went to the revolution in 2011 and supported 2013, they tell you, we only care about feeding our kids, and that kind of madness needs to stop.
So I think that's right, but it is pretty cynical. What I think happened was that those people in the street couldn't organize. They couldn't turn the street energy into political activism. And this left the Muslim Brotherhood, who of course was ruthlessly organized all through the country. And the other surprise I think we saw in the parliamentary was the Salafi vote. So everybody knew the Brotherhood was going to do well, and they did 45% or something like that. But the Salafis came in with over 25. So you had close to a 70% Islamic government. And there is an old line traditional party called the WAFT, and I could never quite figure out what they were doing here. You know, we talk to them and try and mobilize them. But Mohammed's right. This was also began to see a lot of labor unrest because expectations of workers had been encouraged by Tahrir Square, and this didn't result in higher wages or better working conditions or all the things that workers want. So you began to see a lot of labor unrest spreading around the country, and I agree with Mohammed, that began to spook average citizens.
What about the progressive movements, the groups that had been out on the streets during the early days of the revolution?
The work was admirable, but again, they couldn't organize. They couldn't organize a political movement. So they were essentially isolated. They didn't. And the other thing I was struck with on the ground was how well organized the Muslim Brotherhood was. You know, you'd go to these polling places, and you'd see trucks unload dozens of women covered head to toe in black to do voting, and they were all over the country. Let's talk about the election process, and this was very controversial in Washington, but let me be crystal clear. Mohammed Morsi won free and fair. There is no question about that. You may hear otherwise from Egyptians, but it's not true. And yes, there was a confluence of events. Some of the candidates, like Amr Musa, didn't do as well as people expected. So there were factors that knocked out some of the more moderate members, but he won free and square. And here's my take on the Muslim Brotherhood. I believe that the U.S. could have worked with the Muslim Brotherhood government what I say about Mohammed Morsi was there was no problem with his religious beliefs. What was the problem is that he didn't know what he was doing. And he was like the fourth level of the Muslim Brotherhood candidates. They had much better leaders in Morsi, but through technicalities or other things, they'd sort of been eliminated from the vote. And so he was very inexperienced. And didn't have a strong team. We had some good guys, or he didn't have a strong team around him. But there were things that we tried to. First of all, these members of the Muslim Brotherhood have no objection to making money. They're not Nasserite socialists, and a lot of them were successful businessmen and had interest in trade and things like that. So I don't think they were a threat to the U.S. The Israelis were extremely upset because they saw the election of the Brotherhood as sort of a mirror on Hamas, and what things like Morsi did that drove people crazy had nothing to do with his religion or his religious beliefs, or even with the Muslim Brotherhood, but more to do with his, frankly, not knowing what's going on. And the other factor that we didn't take into account because we weren't that informed about it, this comes with the coup later on, was how some of the Gulf countries just went crazy when the Brotherhood was elected. And we can talk about the coup later, but that was my take on the Brotherhood. That they won. They had an extremist element too. I don't mean to sound naive. One of the things we sat down with some of these women, who were leaders in the Brotherhood, and they wanted to lower the marriage age and do all kinds. They had certainly had what I would call a more radical element. But I thought with the leadership, it was a pretty pragmatic bunch, and the U.S. could have worked with them.
I can present how we have seen the United States rule from Cairo. I think people were disappointed, I would say. First of all, they believe that giving a blank check to that government at that time, especially during the heat of the political turmoil, especially between 2012 to 2013, that would really empower the Brotherhood to do what they want. And what they want is constitution, full hold over the institutions of the country, and that freaked the middle class out. Like everyone, the middle class, Cairo, Alexandria, Delta, speak to anyone, everyone is freaking out. And these are Muslims. My family, other families, that's no go. And no go because it's our not only lifestyle, not only the way we do religion, not only the way we live, but also we have seen the identity of the entire country being hijacked overnight. And we didn't sign up for that. We signed up for elections. Like that guy was elected. Yes, he was definitely elected fair and square. No dispute about that. But when you elect someone to change the entire country's identity, that's provoke a lot of fears and a lot of resistance as well, especially if you're not part of the conversation. If that conversation just a Muslim Brotherhood / the Salafist movement writing their own constitution at that time, people basically decided to take matter in their own hand and keep revolting in the streets. So for an entire year, and that was the 1 year rule of Mohammed Morsi, you have protests every week, every weekend, and it started to be street clashes. And I think people were disappointed because they thought that not that Washington has that much leverage. We get that. We understand that. This is not 1980s anymore. We get that. I think there were expectation that Washington will be open for a dialogue between not only the Muslim Brotherhood but also progressives in the streets or people in the streets who are not political actors, who are not really organized in a similar way like the Muslim Brotherhood, but they're active. They have their own weight. They in the presidential elections, they have multiple candidates with multiple millions of votes. I think that would have been much more appreciated. And I think at that time as well, people were looking also for Washington to press the Muslim Brotherhood into certain kind of concessions to the people in the streets.
So I want to answer that because I think that's a misconception. First of all, it's not Washington's job or the job of the United States to, I mean, this is an Egyptian issue, to push the Muslim Brotherhood into making concessions in the streets. And we had endless discussions with the Muslim Brotherhood about some of the, frankly, stupider things they did, like appoint the fellow who had gotten out of jail, who killed Sadat as governor, I think, in Luxor. But ultimately, he was the elected leader of Egypt, and this is where I would part ways with some of the more progressives, because these progressives were frankly enthusiastic, from what I could see, about a military coup. And I'd like to ask them now, how do they think that turned out? Because they were willing to throw over. I grant you, boy, as I say, I knew Morsi, and I knew he didn't really know what he was doing, but he was a few months away from parliamentary elections where Egyptians would have had a chance to vote their beliefs on this. And so now now the country of Egypt has a military dictatorship that has made certain economic progress for sure, but is vastly more repressive. So at some point you have to sort of stand on principle. And that's what I thought a lot of people in Egypt were. Democracy was great as long as their guy was going to be elected, and he wasn't elected. I just don't know how to square that circle.
Well, no one likes what's happening right now, that's for sure. At that time, it was different. At that time, there was some much more dynamic situation, and people can make an argument that the stability of Egypt means you personally, Ambassador, I mean, that the international players need to talk to that government at that time to ensure the stability and eventually to avoid something like what we are seeing right now.
Well, I think that sort of puts one too much credit and too much on the ability of the United States to really, because the problem with Morsi really was that he didn't really listen to anybody. He didn't listen to Harat al-Shader. He didn't listen to some of these other leaders who might have promised a more productive path. He didn't listen to his prime minister. He didn't really listen to anybody. And he went there toward the end and gave those two quite idiotic, for want of a better word, speeches, and basically sort of challenged the military to overthrow him. And where he had managed, and there were a lot of Americans who thought we should just say, that they didn't like the Muslim Brotherhood to begin with, and they particularly didn't like him. And again, this was another very heated discussion within the U.S. How do you do this? How do you react to a military coup? Of course, we didn't call it a coup initially, but that's what it was. What's the American response to that?
So, after more protests and calls for Mohammed Morsi's ouster, the military stepped in on July 3rd, 2013, and deposed Morsi in a coup.
How did the U.S. deal with that in the summer of 2013 and the non-coup event that happened? And I was actually working in NEA during that time, and I just remember it being sort of the big issue you think it was, and that people talk about.
So it wasn't hard to build a relationship with the military, because of course we already had one literally for decades. And when I went back with Secretary Kerry 2 or 3 years later, we went to see President al-Sisi, and he said I'd met with him like 32 times. And that sounded like a lot, but I'd seen him a lot, and I knew him very well. So it wasn't that we didn't know these guys in the SCAF, and we didn't know then General al-Sisi. So it was obvious, because they told us, frankly, that they were gonna remove Morsi from office. That wasn't a secret. And we had many encounters with the military, and Secretary Hagel had many discussions with military leadership, saying, don't do this. You're gonna you're gonna trigger and restrictions in U.S. law but again, there were a lot of people in Washington who weren't sorry to see Mohammed Morsi go. I mean, I would say they didn't like how he went, but they weren't sorry to see him go. So we tried to negotiate between the Brotherhood and the military for several weeks. The Secretary Kerry tried to negotiate a deal through Qatar and some other countries. And then after Morsi was overthrown, Bill Burns, who was then Undersecretary, came out with De Leon, who was the UN rep, and they tried to negotiate sort of a gradual stand down on both sides, but none of it worked, to be blunt. And I think the Brotherhood Morsi was very stubborn about sort of making concessions, because there were many of them on the table, whether he would hand over power to another leadership, or he would call for elections sooner, or whether there were a variety of options on the table. But none of it worked.
7.5 years later, with the Sisi regime still in power, how do things look today? Here's Mohammed.
It's a very complex situation. I have been far away from home for the last couple of years. I still visit, but I don't have that kind of I don't know how they feel right now about the entire politics. However, there's that kind of feeling that we're going apolitical. We're not going to discuss politics anymore. We're going to focus on the bigger picture. So you often talk to people who say, yeah, we focus on the developed mega infrastructure projects that the president is doing. We understand that there is a major geopolitical challenge for the country, which is the Nile. Everyone right now in Cairo is focused on the Nile and the Nile issue and the East Med. So I can describe it as there is a feeling that people want to forget what happened in 2011. There is a collective denialism that people feel that the last 10 years were really bad and troubling for the nation, as a society, and we need to go past that. And we need to focus on the material gains that being delivered by the current leadership, and to avoid any kind of discussion about politics, elections, succession, human rights, all the stuff that basically shaped the 2000s and the 2010s are not part of the daily discussion of Egyptians at this point.
I think that's right. I think Egypt has made some economic advances, particularly on the energy side, which I think and has compliance with the IMF agreement. But I think a lot of and I'm not Egyptian, so I don't want to. A lot of the underlying demographic issues are still there. There are a lot of employment issues. There's still a lot of poverty. My goodness, if this Ethiopian dam is filled, that could still the water shortages. So there are a lot of environmental and demographic issues. And what I wonder, and I'd be interested in Mohammed's views about this, because people who follow the Middle East talk a lot about this, is the Arab Spring really over, or is it just waiting for sort of a new generation? In other words, people like him who were in Tahrir Square may not want to go back there, but in another 10 years or 15 years, people won't remember a lot of this, and the problems will still be there.
In my view, I don't believe that it's a dichotomy between revolution, not revolution. I do believe that the way forward would be different between society to society. I'm not sure if the way forward in Egypt would be the same for Lebanon and Libya. I can speak about Egypt. I think people have an idea that revolutions means disruption. Bad or good, they're not discussing this, but they're saying that revolution means disruption and destabilization and lower economic status. And there is no appetite for that. What people want is reform, fair and square. They want reform, they want representation. As you mentioned, a lot of the underlying root causes that led to 2011 is still there. Demographics, unemployment, for sure. And these problems are gonna stay for a while. And people, in addition to solving these problems, they also want representation. However, they agree that they don't want to go through the same cycle of instability again. What's the next? How this is going to materialize in the future? I think it might be something new, unique, different. But the old way of let's take down a regime and march in the streets of Cairo, there's less appetite for this.
I think one important thing is sort of it would certainly be desirable to see a sort of gradual opening up to the political process. And I think I wouldn't entirely rule that out. I mean, again, I'm not following it as closely as I did when I was there, but at some point that the military would see its way to basically giving people more of a voice. And I think Al-Sisi's been lucky because of the basically the economy's been pretty good, more than pretty good in some years. But if you had a downturn, that could reverse, I think.
Next week, we'll head to Yemen for a conversation between US Ambassador at the time, Ambassador Jerry Feuerstein, and Yemeni scholar Ibrahim Jalal. We'll hear about events in 2011, the unfolding of revolution in the country, and the humanitarian consequences of the war since then. Thank you for listening to this series. Please leave a rating and a review or subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts and send any feedback to diplomacy@georgetown.edu. Funding for this podcast comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York's Bridging the Gap initiative. Thank you to Ambassador Barbara Bodine, Ambassador Elizabeth Richard, Ambassador John DeRocha, Hira Kamboj, Hamad, Andrew Hanna, and many others who have helped put together this series. See you next time.